Our messages from young people and our research. And for the last 4 or 5 years, we have been focusing our interest on children who are vulnerable offline, even before they go online. So we're looking at how their life offline and their pre-existing vulnerabilities might affect the experience they have online. Oh, I have my first problem. I can't make the slides are not moving forward.
Maybe just to click with your mouse. Sometimes this helps.
Okay, I will go. Yeah, there we go. So we're working. Sorry for that. The survey happens every year. It's called the Cybersurvey, and it goes into schools and collects data from young people. The most recent publications are these 3 reports and our research studies, which we'll discuss later. In their own words, talks about the whole survey and answers to all the questions. It's an overview. Look at Me is about teens sexting and sharing self-generated images and the risks that they experience afterwards. Refuge and Risk, which is what we're talking about today, describes the lives of vulnerable people online, and they use the internet as a refuge, somewhere to escape to get away from their offline problems in the real world, and then they often encounter particular risks. So these 3 reports are all available free online at these links. And I want to start off by talking about the clear messages that we want to get across to you today. There is a big digital disparity, a difference between the online experiences of the vulnerable children and their peers, other children their age living in their area who do not have vulnerabilities. So if you're already vulnerable on offline, there is an increased chance of online risk. If you have more than one vulnerability, or perhaps even 3 or more, you have a greater chance of online harm. The more vulnerabilities the child has, the more there is a chance that they will experience online harm. Also, because there are relationships found between the different types of risk, if a young person experiences one of the types, there is an increased chance that they are already or will be soon experiencing others. So it's a really good moment to intervene and try and prevent this. Also, we want to emphasize what an intense experience the internet is for vulnerable young people. They need it, they depend on it, they get comfort from it, they self-soothe by calming their moods, and they also are at a huge risk. And if for some reason things go wrong for them, they feel it even more acutely than anybody else. So we're proposing new ways of working with vulnerable children. This next paragraph just tells you about where our evidence comes from. And we run these annual surveys. Now we have over 53,000 young people over 12 years. Our research partnership has made a very big difference to the survey. Dr. El Assam has strengthened the survey, given it more of an emphasis on well-being, and helped us to really do valuable research using this data. Who did we study? We studied 5 groups of young people who have offline vulnerabilities. We've got one group we call family and social. That's people in or leaving care, the state care sector. Young people who care for a relative who is incapacitated, perhaps mentally ill, perhaps suffering from substance misuse, or somehow unable to fully parent and the young person is doing a lot of caring. And we have people who say, I worry about life at home. In the communication group, these are people who don't hear or cannot speak clearly, or they have vision loss. So their communication is affected. And in addition, we are looking at people who don't have English as a first language, because online, certainly here in the UK, all terms and conditions and advice about staying safe online comes in English. People with special needs, these are self-identified. Young people said, I have learning difficulties, or I am autistic. Then we have a psychological group where young people said, I have a mental health difficulty, and we have a very large number of those. We also have people who say, I have an eating disorder, and I have anger issues. And our final group is people who have a physical disability or long-term illness. Now, you may be wondering why we have little stars on 3 of these items. It's because they're not a pre-existing vulnerability in the sense that a disability might be, but they are a disadvantage that the young person has, which is showing up in the way they act online. Then we took the risks and we grouped them into 6 types. We have given them names to make it easy for you to understand and remember the different groups. And here they are. Conduct is like behavior. And it's important to remember that we've looked at answers where people said they did this often, rather than just once or twice or sometimes. You can see that they've said they visit pages meant for adults, or dating sites, gambling sites. They are sexting. That means sharing an explicit photograph or video. They've met up with someone they only knew online, but they didn't really know who they were. And they're spending a lot of money in games, not just once or twice, but often. Compulsion describes when you cannot pull yourself away from the technology. Problematic computer use. So these are people who said that most of the time they felt this way. They felt they couldn't manage their online life, or they got very irritated and anxious if they were without their phone. And interestingly, they are also people who said, I feel my online self is better than my real self. And I feel my online life has caused problems, both with family, friends, and schoolwork. The contact group, this is when they are in contact with other people online. Many of them believe that the internet helped them make a good relationship with someone, and it may well be very supportive and very helpful to them, but equally it could be harmful. These are people who felt someone was trying to control or stalk me through the phone, or someone tried to persuade me into sexual activity I did not want. Revenge sharing describes when, after a breakup in a relationship, the other partner shares intimate photographs without your permission. Fake solicitation is when somebody thinks that the person they're talking to is a young person interested in them romantically, but they turn out not to be who they said they were. And then there are young people who say they've met scary people online. Content is interesting because content has overtaken cyber aggression in the last couple of years. So more young people are experiencing a risk from content than the number or the percentage who are experiencing cyber aggression. They're looking at material that encourages you to bulk up your body, which often means buying steroids to do so. Material that is pre-anorexia, encouraging people to be too thin. Talking about suicide. Nude pictures they did not search for. Very violent pictures. Pictures that, or messages that promote racism, violence, or hatred, and even extremist views. Cyber aggression is very simple and clear. People have either been cyberbullied or experienced racism, homophobia, or insults and comments that they see, not necessarily directed at them personally, but they see them underneath material that's been posted. And then the final one is cyber scams. And this describes people who experience a scam. They are tricked into something. They have problems with credit cards. They're often, especially carers, for example, are using credit cards. Perhaps their parent wants them to buy something online and the parent is not confident in digital. They might ask their child to do this, or they've used their card for their child to spend money in games or in an app, and things go wrong, and the child can almost by accident create a very big bill for the parent. So here you can see that our multiple vulnerabilities do make the likelihood greater that the young person could experience risk. The dark blue bars are people who have 3 or more vulnerabilities, and the light blue are people who have none. So you can see in every category of risk, we have a higher percentage of people who experience online harm. Here are some words directly from young people describing how they see the internet for them. Those are positive, that are in green, and the ones below that are possibly less positive. I'll leave you to read those. Don't forget the young man sitting on the stairs on the right. Now we're going to show you 6 graphs. Each one represents one of those categories of risk that we've described. And what we're showing here is how each of the vulnerable groups, young people with an offline vulnerability, how did they report their experience of this particular risk? So you can see here that at the top of the graph, we've got people who are care experienced. That means they've been in the care of the state and not looked after by their own parents, but they've had to be taken into care because their family's been unable to look after them. It's a very traumatic experience. They are right at the top of this. And then we have people here with an eating disorder who also report very high experiences of conduct risk. Then there are people with physical illnesses or disabilities. And some of you may be surprised to see how people with speech and hearing difficulties are high in these graphs. In every single one of them, they report very high levels of these risks. And I think they're important because we often don't realize the extent to which they're at risk online, and I want to draw your attention to them. What we can see at the lower end of this graph, and in all the others too, you might think that for people who said English is not my first language, it's really quite a small risk. But if you look at the bottom bar where people have no vulnerabilities, you'll realize that they are almost twice as likely to experience risk than people with no vulnerabilities. And this is important to remember because we tend to think that if they're at the bottom of the chart, it's not so serious, but actually you can see it's extremely serious. And on some of these points, like gambling sites, visiting gambling sites, it's quite clear that people down here with no vulnerabilities hardly do this at all. Whereas in the top sector, we can see that 18% of care experienced and 19% of those with eating disorders are visiting gambling sites. So the difference in the behavior is quite marked. Here we can see content, and you can see those with eating disorders are very reading and looking at imagery in all of the categories. So it's not really sufficient to concentrate only on, are they looking at pro-anorexia content online, but it's important to be aware that they are also looking at material with extremist views, material that dares you to do something dangerous, violent images and videos. They're looking at content with violent hatred and racism, and quite worryingly, material that encourages self-harm and talks about suicide. So while you may be well aware of the risk for these young people online, you may not have thought about some of these other categories. Here we can see also that those with speech difficulties have risen very high in this chart, and that's something to bear in mind. In contact, we still have a very big concern about those with eating disorders, but speech difficulties, those with speech and hearing are really experiencing a lot of difficulties in the contact risk area. They are targeted by others who can often tell that they are very eager to be accepted in teenage social groups. They'll do anything to be accepted. So we can see that they are really targeted in this way. And while we mention that, I'd like to say something about being non-judgmental when working with young people who have all these risks and harms. It's not their own behavior only which is leading to this, and it's important not to be judgmental. The internet is not designed for children. There's persuasive design. There's a lot of algorithms deciding what you will be shown, and these young people are particularly targeted and manipulated. So I think we want to suggest that a really non-judgmental approach is needed. So these people in compulsion, they are unable to put down their phone or walk away from the games console. They are the sort of child that the parent will struggle to get to come and eat. Some even said, I forget to wash and eat. They're very dependent on their phone, both because it makes them feel confident and they reduce their fear, but also because they get very anxious and irritated if they haven't got their phone. And taking away their phone as a punishment because they've come into a circumstance online that you feel, a parent might feel they shouldn't have done this, that can lead to really desperate circumstances. Some young people have said, I felt as if my whole identity was taken away. And we have seen cases here in the UK of suicides as a consequence. So handling this is a very delicate task. You can see also in the compulsion graph that those with anger issues have risen quite high to here, up with the people we've seen at the top of the graphs in the previous ones. So those with anger issues may be playing very aggressive games, or they may be fighting with people online, but we don't know exactly why they are so high. Cyber aggression, it's really interesting to see that those with hearing difficulties are cyberbullied to such a high extent. You can see that 40% of them have been cyberbullied, whereas for young people with no vulnerabilities, only 16% report having been cyberbullied. So it's really interesting to try and do some work to change this and to tackle it with the wider population of youth. Those with an eating disorder, 48% report being cyberbullied. And we can also see that they've experienced quite a lot of racist messages, racist comments. 32% of them are reporting that. And there are also insults about being, homophobic insults about being gay or lesbian. And this is very prevalent. So it's about tackling the whole youth population and how they're going about their relationships with others. And finally, cyber scams. Well, it's quite predictable. We can see those who are tricked into buying fake goods. People with learning difficulties over here, for example, they don't necessarily understand what the website is saying. Here you've got a question about having your social media hacked. And this is a very useful question you can use in practice, because when wanting to talk to young people about these things, it's difficult not to be invasive in your questioning. But if you ask about, have you ever had your social media account hacked? They find that a more acceptable question, and it often is a way into a conversation about more delicate areas that you may struggle to ask about. So a reminder of our less visible groups. I think you've realized now that those who worry about life at home, those who are socially isolated, such as with a physical illness or disability, and those who have speech and hearing difficulties, and young carers seem to have been overlooked, certainly in practice until recently, and we want to bring them to your attention. If you're wondering how you could use this, at a glance, you could look at these graphs and see what other aspects of online life you might need to consider if you are working with a young person with one of these vulnerabilities, or possibly many vulnerabilities. You can do some thoughtful planning, looking at the less visible groups. You can look at your casework and think about, how are we assessing digital risk? Are we even assessing it? Do we see any trends we might need to change our practice and our response? Do we include digital risk in referrals? And in your data, is your data held in your case notes and it's never collected, so your training is not really proactive? And in an ongoing way, you need to use this data possibly in prevention, in early intervention, and in new forms of support, and to teach online safety in a new way. What we are clear about is that the generic single education of young people in online safety in school, for example, isn't sufficient for young people with offline vulnerabilities. So what works? All of the above work, but some local government agencies have very small groups of children in care that they are supporting, or small groups of children with special needs, and work within those small familiar groups about their online safety in new ways has really made a difference. It's cheap, it's low key, it's easy to do, and it seems to be so far working quite well. To change ideas, I would urge you to think digital in everything you're doing in your work with vulnerable young people. But it's not that easy, and we did notice some challenges. We've learned that in the UK, at least, schools are well trained to spot risk of harm, and they are well trained in what we call safeguarding. But when they pick up a case and refer it to a specialist service, the specialist service often lacks digital expertise. Without trained data, it's not really possible to plan ahead or to be up to date. In casework, we see that the tools are weak for assessment. They're often generic or out of date. Many people only ask about social media and don't ask about the rest of the internet. Case note data is seldom accessible. We understand that the digital risk is often left out of referrals if you're referring a young person to another service because they need further professional help. Is a description of their digital life included? And the trust young people have in adults to solve online problems is going down year on year. So we have a battle to regain their trust. I would like to say a little bit about what does not work. Showing a very frightening video or telling them a terrible, scary story about what can happen if you don't follow the rules, and then giving them 5 rules, that doesn't work. Rules and tools in isolation are unlikely to really make a difference. Teens are very, very bored with e-safety education, so we have to think it through again in new ways, approach it in ways that are relevant to their lives. And we, as I said before, one size, one model doesn't work for everyone. I'm going to turn over to my colleague, Dr. El Assam, at the moment to talk a bit more about our research. We have got one available report that explains the relationships between the different categories of risk in beautiful diagrams, which he created. And we'll give you, I'm going to hand over now, and these are published and forthcoming papers.
Hello everyone, this is Ayman El Assam from Kingston University. Try not to repeat what Adrian has explained so far, and I can see that there's a question for us already, but we will answer as soon as we finish here. So I'll keep it very brief in this matter on this slide. So as you can see here, that we have a series of publications, we have a lot of data to utilize, and we are trying to make as much sense of it as possible. So as Adrian explained before, in our research, we look at different types of online risk, but also looking at emotional and psychological well-being too. I refer to it as psychological distress for simple reasons, but I'll explain that in more details. So the first, vulnerable young people and their experience of online risk, this is has been published 2018. This is when we, categorized vulnerable young people into different categories, family vulnerability, special educational needs, and other vulnerabilities. And what we found at that time is that compared to non-vulnerable groups, generally speaking, vulnerable young people are more at risk of experiencing one or more risks. Okay, and then we moved on into a more qualitative study, and this was done in one local authority in the UK. And we have interviewed more than 15 individuals for that purpose. And what we found was that practitioners, psychologists, social workers, educators, police officers, they often focus on child sexual exploitation online. They focus on online grooming, and they don't attend to other risks. And as you can see from the slides presented by Adrian, is that we have a lot of different types of risks out there. So sometimes, to be aware of online grooming, you need to be aware of contact risk and other forms of risk. Communication with adults is an indication of online grooming. So we have to approach it as a whole rather than being selective at one risk. What we found was also that, assessment tools used by practitioners or services around the child are very dated. An example of those tools is the strength and difficulty questionnaire. I'm sure some of you are aware of it. It's quite dated and doesn't ask any question about what the child does online. So this is an example of how dated our systems are. And one of the comments made by Adrian earlier, or recommendations, I should say, is think digital. And it's really important because whatever you do nowadays, working around the child, think digital, because the child is spending most of his or her time during the day doing something digital, playing games, communicating with others online, on different, online platforms, etc. So you would find a lot of young people using the online platforms for more than 5 hours a day. So that's why I think Adrian is asking everyone to think digital. If you can't see it, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. As a practitioner, you need to keep an open mind. So it comes to our third article, as it's under review, and this is quite an important article. And my theory here was that what unifies all vulnerable young children is one thing, mainly, is their psychological well-being. So I have looked at, children with special educational needs, children with physical disabilities, children who are carers for a member of their family, or in care or looked after. And what I found was that their psychological well-being is a lot poorer than a child with no vulnerability. So from that perspective, I wanted to find whether it's actually the vulnerability that leads to risk, or is it actually, or this correlation is actually mediated by psychological distress. And what I mean by psychological distress here is depression, anxiety, and low self-esteem. Okay, and what I've found out of this article, which is a major contribution, is that the majority of vulnerable children have poor psychological well-being, and as a result, they are more likely to experience online risk, or more likely to be exposed to online risk. Okay, and so that's quite important, and this is also in line with the last article to your right, which covers the same thing. Although it's a different article, but it covers the same theme. So in short, psychological well-being is the core mediator between vulnerability and risk on the other side. So if you want to think about, if you are ever exposed to a vulnerable child, you need to take into consideration their psychological well-being, depression and anxiety, etc. So the glaring gap is another qualitative study, and we did that to actually confirm the qualitative findings from the second article to your from the left. Okay, so again, they are following the same themes and revealed, poor practice when it comes to digital lives. We also found that being vulnerable and having a parent who has good e-safety skills, good communication with a child, stops them, or to a certain extent, from experiencing online risk. So this is kind of key findings from those articles to be published hopefully very soon. But what I would like to end this with is think motivations. I can speak for my age. I used to go out and play outside the house most of the time. Whether it's playing with my horses or playing football with the neighbors, etc. But nowadays, the child doesn't have to leave their bedroom. So there is a contrast to, as a practitioner, for myself, contrast between my life and children of the digital age, if I could call it that way. So our mental health has shifted. I would like you to think about escapism. Children who are experiencing distress, psychological distress, are more likely to resort to the internet to seek, as a coping mechanism, to escape their family issues, to escape their psychological issues, to escape their physical limitations if they are disabled. So, and I also want you to think about what the internet gives the child. The internet gives the child a sense of autonomy. They can decide who they want to get in touch with. It gives them a sense of relatedness. They relate to different groups across the globe. They don't have to have friends from, I don't know, Sweden or Spain. They can have friends from, Singapore or Australia. So they relate to people who have similar identities or have similar interests in life. And there's a sense of competence as well. Competence is when the child feels competent in doing something. Online gaming, for example, children engage in online gaming and, and they develop some sort of competence. And as a result, they feel that they have to do it most of the time because this is the only thing that they're good at. and they forget that there is a life outside, their online platforms. Thinking about all of those kind of psychological motivations, my theory is that all of this leads or kind of fuels their exposure to online risk. And I think there's a lot of things that I've made notes of that I would like to talk about, but I realize that we are quite limited in terms of time. So I think it's probably time to take more questions, or Adrian, if you want to add something to this. You are on mute, Adrian.
I'm happy. I think you still have a little time if you want to, but we can take questions and then you can.
Yeah, I mean, if I have time, then stop me when you can. I think one of the key things that I haven't addressed here is something that you hear quite often: internet addiction. Adrian referred to it as compulsions. I would like you to remember that there's no such thing called internet addiction. You can't really get addicted to internet because it's not really a substance. So according to the DSM, or Diagnostic or Statistical Manual for Psychologists, there is no behavioral addictions. Most of the addictions are substance-based, but there is one behavioral addiction, which is kind of mainly gambling, gambling disorder. So there is a term we call problematic internet use. It's a replacement for internet addiction. It's basically explaining that the majority of young people, more so vulnerable young people, according to my findings, are more obsessed with the internet. So they show signs of obsession and compulsion. Yeah, they rely on the internet very much, and they can't really live life without it. They also have what we call control disorder. Again, control disorder, it means that they realize that they are spending too much time on the internet. However, they are not able to stop it. They're not able to stop chatting to older men, or they can't really stop playing violent games. They can't, stop accessing, for example, pornographic websites. Okay, so that's the control disorder, and neglect. And I think Adrian also referred to that. Neglect refers to children and young people acknowledging that they are neglecting their family duties, their homework duties, and all sorts of duties in favor of staying online. Yeah, they would rather stay in the bedroom, play games, or chat to people all the time, rather than just go and sit with the family and have a chat about life, generally speaking. So neglect, control, and obsessions are all three main signs for an addictive type of personality or problematic internet use. So it's good to kind of look at, if you are working with young clients or young children, it's good to assess their obsession and assess their level of neglect, and also assess their level of control, their ability to control their behavior. But, there's another theory that explains that a lot of young children are fearing of missing out. Yeah, we call it the FOMO theory. I'm sure you've probably heard of it, the fear of missing out. Children are glued to and I'm not saying that I say children, but it's actually true about some adults, as well. So it's, but as we are, my research and Adrian's research mainly, among children, adolescents. So we talk about them most of the time. The FOMO theory is called fear of missing out, is a form of anxiety that children and young people develop, and that's why they feel that they have to experience all sorts of things, even if it's risk, sexting, for example. They would say that every other child is sending nude pictures. Why shouldn't I send a nude picture? Okay, so they don't want to miss out on that particular experience. So knowing their limits, knowing their limitation is quite a challenge. So if you're a psychologist out there, think about validation. You know, what children get out of, you know, frequent access to the internet. Think about how much validation they get. But with validation, if you put yourself out there, if you have eating disorder, or are very slim, very thin, and you post a picture of yourself online, of course, you're going to get a lot of compliments, but sometimes you're going to get a lot of harassment as well from others. So with validation, with compliments comes also harassment. The problem is that some children are not prepared for negative reviews and fear judgment of others. So no wonder that those with eating disorders, as Adrian explained earlier, come at the very top, because they are the most likely to post pictures of themselves online, very slim and very thin. And as a result, you know, they put themselves out there for comments and judgments. And there is so many things to consider, and it's almost like our psychological understanding and theories are also quite dated, because we have to apply them online too. So online we get quick validations, quick reward, and we don't really get punishment. We get away with it, yeah, most of the time. So the risk and reward is not really balanced, and as a result, we are disinhibited. Or the children are disinhibited. Disinhibited means that they feel that whatever they do has no consequences to it. Yeah, if they share a nude picture, if they have access to some, you know, gambling websites or pornographic material, they feel that no one is there to judge them or stop them from doing it. Okay, this is an interesting theory called the online disinhibition effect. If you have time, you know, it's quite an interesting read to Google. And I will stop there, because I think I came to 1:45 our time. So I'll stop it there. If you have any questions, yeah, feel free to ask.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you, Dr. Ayman, for sharing such an interesting and I would say really useful presentation with us. And I would just like to add on this that we will upload the recording, but also the presentation. I believe that all of this data you could use as a tool when planning and interacting with children and thinking about all of the risks they talked about and thinking about the safety in general. So it's the time for questions. We have some time. There are a few questions already in the chat box. I will read them one by one. And when you feel, Adrian or Ayman, Dr. Ayman, that you want to answer it, please feel free to answer it. So the first one was, can you please share more about the sample of the research?
Adrian, do you want to go with that?
Okay, so there's 15,000, just under 15,000 young people in this piece of work. They come from different parts of the country, north, south, east, and west. They were recruited via schools and various alternative education centres for children who perhaps couldn't remain in school. We take a lot of trouble to encourage the participation of children who do have different needs or have different abilities, and we encourage schools to make it possible for those children to, those teenagers to take part. The age group is 11 to 17. So I hope we've got equal male and female, and we have a growing group of people who said they did not wish to state their gender. It's around about between 3 and 5%, but it seems each year to get a little higher.
Thank you, Adrian, for your answer. The second question is how was eating disorder defined in the research?
It's a self-identified question. It says, are any of these true for you? And then there's a very big range of vulnerabilities, and the child decides whether they are true for them, or they write, none of these apply to me. So it's not clear that it's diagnosed. It's in the child's opinion, they believe they have this difficulty.
Okay, there is also a question, what is the reason scary stories don't work? It was in this part you shared, you remember? Yeah, I see. Okay.
There are different reasons why they don't work. A certain percentage of the children viewing a terrifying film, for example, then do not develop good skills online. They avoid the internet, and then suddenly they go on unprepared because their friend says, you know, join me in this chat. So we get, especially girls, we get a lot of girls who actually leave their online life because of a terrifying film. It has been the case that a lot of very well-made films have been shown in schools for quite some time, but they are very frightening because a few rules only are not going to be sufficient in your life, as I think Eamon has just described. You need to understand motivation, you need to understand what they are looking for online and in what way they make themselves vulnerable. So a few rules are not enough to counter the risk. And because large percentages of our sample say these things didn't happen to me, for example, amongst those who did share explicit photographs, 78% said nothing bad happened afterwards. So if you've told them it's always bad, terrible things will always happen, which many adults do, then they stop believing all of your advice because they think it's all rubbish, because amongst their friends, they know that it didn't always result in a bad outcome. So we have to be really careful to go with their perception.
Yes, really interesting explanation. Thank you. And we have a final question here for now. We will see if there will be more. This question is, could you give us any tips on how to make e-safety education more enticing for youth? I think it's attractive or something. Yeah.
Eamon, do you want to do this, or would you like me to do it?
From my perspective, I'm a counselor as well. So I always say, you know, don't talk at the children, don't talk at them, talk with them. You know, for me, it's always, it's a relationship with children. You know, if I was to advise, obviously, Adrian is the more e-safety, you know, is more of an e-safety advisor than me. But from a humanistic perspective, children tend to listen to those who listen to them. Yeah. So if I was to design an e-safety education tool, I would put it to the children first. I will ask them, what do you want to include in your e-safety protocol? And then they will tell me what to include, and then I will incorporate it and put it back to them. So this is collaborative work with children. And we're not showing them that we are the experts and you know nothing. Most of the time, they know much better than us. And Adrian might acknowledge that. So I think, you know, listen to them, you know, make them partners in e-safety, you know, rather than recipients, if that makes sense. Adrian might want to add something to that. Yeah. You're on mute, sorry.
I could give you some actual examples, exactly as Eamon has said. As I've become older, when I walk into a class of 15-year-olds and they hear that it is going to be about online safety, they look at me and think, what does she know? And they rock back on their chairs, they fold their arms, and I take advantage of this. I put it that in a way that they are educating me. So I have a whole lot of problems, scenarios. I have cards that say what if, and they each have a scenario, and I'm asking them to explain what they would do in a situation like this. And I pretend to know less, but what I'm listening for is the gaps in their knowledge. So when they explain what they would do in these scenarios, I'm listening for what don't they know. And then I would ask a question, yes, but what if that happened? And then we explore the gap. And I want the teacher of this class to be in the class during the session, not marking books or talking to other staff in the staff room, because when we are gone, if we have visited a school, they need to pick up and fill the gaps and also be very prepared for disclosures. People might disclose problems after you've had the conversation, maybe the next day. So they need to put in place student support for once I'm not there. So I have another suggestion to you. Kinetic work, get them up off their chairs, out of their desks, create a line across the room, a diagonal line from one corner to another. One corner represents no, one corner represents yes, and in the middle is in some circumstances. Then you create the scenarios. You can have scenarios on cards, or you can have them on a PowerPoint. And for each scenario, you ask them, is it safe to do this? And they move to yes or no, or in the middle. And then you ask the people in the middle, well, you chose some circumstances. Tell us what circumstances would make you feel that it was okay to do this. And we have the discussion, everybody joins in, and then we say, do you want to move your position on the line after what you've heard? And of course, people move to a new position, and you can ask them, so what made you move? What made you change your mind? And so it becomes a debate, a discussion, and they're not having to sit still, and they move about the room, and they can argue with each other about their decision. And that helps you understand what next lesson to prepare, because now you know what they're thinking and what the problems are. So those are two quick things we hope can help you.
Thank you for sharing such a very concrete method. And also from Gordana, there is a comment. She said, I actually use this method with my child in everyday problem solving. So it's really great to hear this feedback. Yes. And I was thinking about a lot while you were speaking about some feedback that we got from children in doing also some research, where they said it's kind of don't give us always a lecture on something, which is really great that you talked about relationship, which I believe when there is a trust and there is a relationship, a willingness to see and hear a child from the other side, which is really like a huge plus for being able to communicate with us on letting us in and giving us possibility also to give some kind of feedback and information and some kind of knowledge to them. And okay, I see that we have just like a few minutes until 2 o'clock. Maybe you have some kind of final notes for the end of the webinar. Okay, so thank you very much, Adrienne. Thank you very much, Dr. Ayman, for being with us today, for sharing your time. Final notes from me is that you can get a certificate of attendance for this webinar if you write an email. I will write it in the chat, just a second. To this email in the chat, and you will receive a certificate of attendance on your email in a matter of days. And also for the final thing, there is a short poll that you will see on your screen. Please give us a second also to click and give us a feedback. Like always, I'm encouraging you to stay in touch with the Child Hub and the Child Hub newsletter. I hope that you saw that the Child Hub has changed its looks. It has new colors, a new design, and the platform is rather new in our 6 years of existing. So please stay in touch with us, and stay in touch, of course, with the new webinars that we plan in the next time. Thank you all again, and I wish you a nice rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.